Welcome to a new course on Shakespeare's romances. The essence of human condition is being in time and being aware of it. What is done cannot be undone, and what will happen cannot be foreseen. Bad judgment, vices and faults, excessive passions and impatience, or just fate and fortune can lead to tragedy. In tragedies, man stands and falls alone. In comedies, nature, society, divinities, or some form of providence conspire to avert disaster. The tragedies move in the realm of fate, and comedies in that of providence. Nowhere is the action of providence clearer than in Shakespeare's last plays. Here, the playwright goes beyond mere deus ex machina tricks and introduces what I might call a deus or actor or auctor in fabula. Omniscient Gower, the ultimate author of the story, announces, leads, explains and solves Pericles' adventures, as we already saw. Prospero too is master of puppets, or deputy dramatist as Northrop Frye calls him. In Cymbeline, almighty Jupiter descends in thunder and lightning to chide the ghosts of Posthumus's brothers and to reassure them about their brother's fortune. In The Winter's Tale, the role of chorus and providence is fulfilled by time. It is useful to remember that this play, performed in May 1611, is based on Robert Greene's novel Pandosto, published in 1588, which bears the subtitle The Triumph of Time. That's a very important thing, The Triumph of Time. Despite being a collection of cliches of the well-worn themes and stock situations of pastoral romance, as Stanley Wells writes, Pandosto has the merit of providing Shakespeare with a good story and with a good subtitle, with a very subtle subtitle, I would say. With assistance from a few providential characters and from the Delphic oracle, time triumphs indeed in The Winter's Tale. It even steps on the stage at the beginning of Act 4 to explain what happened in his tale during the 16 years that split the play into two halves. Those 16 years in which Leontes' exposed daughter Perdita grew into a beautiful young woman are the actual triumph of time. As in the other romances, the relation of a father and his daughter lies at the center of the play. Marina and Pericles, Imogen and Cymbeline, Miranda and Prospero, Perdita and Leontes. Now, Suzanne Gossard reads this in a biographical key, but I would not follow in that direction. Mothers, on the other hand, are dead in Cymbeline and The Tempest, and of little relevance in Pericles. But in The Winter's Tale, Hermione becomes as important as her daughter, and presides over the final ceremony of reconciliation. Marina, Imogen, Perdita, and Miranda all symbolize the triumph of time, the triumph of spring over winter, but nowhere is this more obvious than in The Winter's Tale. Now, whereas Pericles has a complex episodic structure, taking the heroes to many shores over numerous years, and The Tempest limits its plot very strictly to 3 or 4 hours spent on a very little island, The Winter's Tale is organized differently. It is divided between Sicilia and Bohemia, and between winter and spring. Northrop Frye thinks that the play is a diptych, divided by time's intervention at the beginning of Act 4. But I think it can also be regarded, and perhaps I prefer to regard it, as an actual triptych. Now, the first third of the play, happening in wintry Sicilia, is dominated by Leontes' jealousy and the plight of those around him. His childhood friend, the King of Bohemia, who escapes poisoning, and Leontes' unfortunate family and courtiers. This part is actual tragedy, including the main characters' hubris and anagnorisis, but stopping short of his death. However, the actual or putative death of Leontis's wife, son and daughter are recorded in this part. The second part takes place 16 years later in Bohemia and in spring this time. This pastoral love comedy is dominated by Leontis's daughter Perdita and by Polixenes' son Prince Florizel. Perdita, who was brought up by Bohemian shepherds, presides over the sheep shearing festival, dressed up as Flora. Flora's love for Florizel and Polixenes' opposition to the marriage is a typical comical plot. This too, however, stops short of its denouement, which happens in the third part of the play, when the entire cast of characters moves back to Sicilia. Leontis and Polixenes, who have caused all the troubles so far, are now in their lives' autumn. They are not really old, not in their winter. But Perdita and Florizel bring spring and life back to Sicilia. This last part, I think, is the actual romance. Its actual mood is wonder, and its culmination is the symbolic resurrection of Leontis's lost wife, reputed dead, Hermione. We thus have three plays in one can say: tragedy, pastoral comedy, and romance. Hence the critics' hesitation when it comes to the play's genre. For these and for other reasons, Harold Bloom considers The Winter's Tale Shakespeare's richest play since Antony and Cleopatra. As always, it's rewarding to examine how Shakespeare transformed his source. In this case, he turned Green's cheesy Elizabethan romance, which was still being enjoyed by chambermaids in the 18th century, into a refined play, rich in mythological symbolism. In Green's novel, Pandosto is the jealous king of Bohemia. His queen is called Bellaria, and Aegisthus, their guest, is king of Sicily. Shakespeare calls Pandosto Leontes, thus suggesting his leonine character, and his wife becomes Hermione, which invokes the psychopomp and trickster god Hermes, but also, as John Ruskin noted, the pillar-like Herma in Greek, and thus her living statue in the last scene. Apparently, Shakespeare's little Latin and less Greek were sufficient for such subtle onomastic games. In classical literature, think for example of Pindar's first Nemean, Sicily is Zeus's gift to Persephone, and festivals were held there to celebrate the return of the goddess and thus of the fertile season. Shakespeare, however, gives Sicilia to Leontes and Hermione and starts his play in the dead of winter. Pastoral Sicily, invoked by Virgil as a bucolic realm in his fourth Eclogue, becomes an Avernian place, the antechamber of hell, a place of sorrow and weeping. Jealous Leontes can thus also be read as a personification of Hades, and Hermione of Persephone. Northrop Frye doubts that the name Bohemia means much of anything, but he's wrong here. The Bohemian spirit of freedom and license, and thus of spring and shepherds, transforms that country into a bucolic pastoral Arcadia. Lush Arcadia is transferred from Sicilia to Bohemia in the first four acts, and moves back to Sicilia only when the entire cast of characters transfers there from Bohemia in the last act. Thus, the first third of the play, from Act 1 to the second scene of Act 3, is set in Sicilia during the winter and is dominated by Leontes' jealousy and rage. If it were a chapter in a novel, this part could be called Leontes' madness. When the play opens in this Sicilian winter of discontent, Leontes and Polixenes are probably in their 20s or 30s. The calendar of shepherds popular in the 16th and 17th century, divides a lifespan of 70 or so years into 4 parties as to youth, strength, wisdom, and age. I quoted from it, corresponding thus to spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The 2 kings would thus be in their lives' summer, or in the age of strength. Their brotherhood, however, and their friendship goes back a long time, to early boyhood. Polixenes recalls that we were as twin lambs that did frisk in the sun and bleat the one at the other. What we changed was innocence for innocence. We knew not the doctrine of ill-doing, nor dreamed that any did. Polixenes wishes they had been boy eternal, living like lambs in this Tirnanog, in this land of eternal youth and innocence. But as Hermione ominously reminds Polixenes, you have tripped since. They are no longer innocent. The Arcadia of lambs, shepherds, youth, and innocence belongs to the prehistory of the play. The dominant winter and the accumulating temptations actually presage ill. For now, the clouds are barely visible on the horizon when the play starts. Leontes cares so much for his boyhood friend that he presses him to stay longer in Sicilia. When Polixenes maintains that he must leave, Leontes asks Hermione to insist as well. You, sir, charge him too coldly, Hermione chides her husband. Before long, however, Leontes will find Hermione's entreaties too hot, I quote. Amazed that Hermione has managed to persuade Polixenes to stay, and irritated by their familiarity, which actually he instigated, Leontes is quickly overcome by jealousy and paranoia. Still virginaling upon his palm, he riddles, while Polixenes and Hermione are walking hand in hand. The virginal is an ancestor of the harpsichord, of a type of keyboard, right, piano, and thus virginaling means puzzling with the fingers. But Leontes' pun obviously betrays his obsession with Hermione's chastity. The fact that Hermione is 9 months pregnant and Polixenes has been their guest all this time further feeds Leontes' paranoia. Infected by jealousy, he muses, affection, thy intention stabs the centre. Thou dost make possible things not so held. Communicatest with dreams. How can this be? With what's unreal thou coactive art, and fellowst nothing, then 'tis very credent thou mayst co-join with something, and thou dost, and that beyond commission, and I find it, and that to the infection of my brains, and hardening of my brows. Affection, intention, infection. The absolute master of the English language writes, and the careful reader may notice that infection borrows its first syllable from intention and the next ones from affection. What's unreal, dreams following nothing, grow into something and ultimately into everything, thus infecting Leontes' brains. Leontes' syntax is as turmoiled and twisted as his passions and reasoning. Russ MacDonald analyzed at some length Leontes' broken syntax and pointed out that the agitation of this speech suggests mental disorder. Even the syntax is tragicomic, MacDonald writes. Leontes' first jealousy speech is gathering storm, but the infection will soon be aggravated. Just a few moments later, as Polixenes, Hermione, and the courtiers exit into the garden, Leontes is left alone with his young son Mamilius and goes berserk. Gone already, inch thick, knee deep, over head and ears a forked one. Go play, boy, play. Thy mother plays, and I play too, but so disgrace the part whose issue will hiss me to my grave. Contempt and clamour will be my knell. Go play, boy, play. There have been, or I am much deceived, cuckolds here now, and many a man there is, even at this present now while I speak this, holds his wife by the arm, that little thinks she has been sluiced in his absence, and his pond fished by his next neighbour, by Sir Smile his neighbour. Nay, there's comfort in it, whilst other men have gates, and those gates open as mine against their will. Should all despair that have revolted wives, the 10th of mankind would hang themselves. Physic for it there is none. It is a bawdy planet that will strike where 'tis predominant. And 'tis powerful, think it, from east, west, north, and south. Be it concluded, no barricado for a belly. Know it. It will let in and out the enemy with bag and baggage. Many thousand ones have the disease, and feel it not. A few moments ago, Leontes was still doubting. Although nothing more has happened in the meantime, he now affirms his inch-thick, knee-deep certitude that Hermione has cuckolded him. The metaphors become gross. Hermione has been sluiced. His pond has been fished by Sir Smile. This is a bawdy planet in which there is no barricado for a belly. For a moment, one can hear Thersites cursing an entire race of whores and cuckolds, as in Troilus and Cressida. The speech is broken, but it has a terrifying madman's coherence. "Go play, boy," he asks Mamilius. But the boy's innocent play stirs sinister thoughts. "Thy mother plays, and I play too." The play is becoming grim. Dramatically and grammatically, as Russ MacDonald well puts it, Leontes' dissonant music and complicated periodicity announce the storm that will end the wintry half of the play. One of the twinned lambs bleating at each other has started roaring. Aptly named Leontes is unveiling his leonine nature, and we must admire once again Shakespeare's genius in renaming Green's Pandosto. Sicilia is no longer the Arcadia sung by Pindar, Virgil, and Ovid. It has become a wilderness of tigers, or of lions, rather. The third fit of jealousy is even more frantic, dissonant, and terrifying. Leontes is sharing his concerns with his trusted courtier, Camillo. "Have you not seen, Camillo? But that's passed out, you have, or your eyeglass is thicker than a cuckold's horn, or heard, for to a vision so apparent rumour cannot be moved, or thought, for cogitation resides not in that man does not think. My wife is slippery. If you will confess, or else be impudently negative to have nor eyes, nor ears, nor thought, then say my wife's a hobby horse, deserves a name as rank as any flax wench that puts to before her troth plight. Say it and justify it." You see how broken this is, all those parentheses. Reason and the senses are all summoned to testify against Hermione. And yet there was nothing to see, nothing to hear, and nothing ill to think about her. Yet, as Stephen Greenblatt notes, the madman turned tyrant accepts no reality but his own. When Camillo answers that he sees nothing wrong in Hermione, Leontes bombards him with what Harold Bloom calls a litany of nothings. Is whispering nothing? Is leaning cheek to cheek? Is meeting noses, kissing with inside lips, topping the career of laughing with a sigh, a note infallible of breaking honesty, horsing foot on foot, skulking in corners, wishing clocks more swift, hours, minutes, noon, midnight, and all eyes blind with a pin and web, but theirs only that would unseen be wicked? Is this nothing? Why then the world and all that's in't is nothing. The covering sky is nothing, Bohemia nothing, my wife is nothing, nor nothing have these nothings, if this be nothing. Terrifying in intensity, Leontes' rage reminds us of the god-sent lunacies of Ajax and Hercules, as Tilliard points out. Only this is no furor sacra or furor heroica, it is sheer madness. The obsessive, incantatory, paranoid repetition of nothing transforms Leontes into one of Shakespeare's high priests of nothing, like Edmund and Iago, as Harold Bloom put it. Othello's murderous jealousy grows out of Iago's nothing in Act 3. Let us remember Othello for a while. What dost thou say? Nothing, my lord, or if I know not what. Was not that Cassio parted from my wife? Cassio, my lord. No, sure I cannot think it, that he would steal away so guilty-like, seeing you coming. You see his hesitations that actually entice Othello. Leontes needs no exterior spur, though. He intoxicates himself, like Lear, and develops his own nothing into something, which threatens to destroy everything. Harold Bloom writes that Leontes displays a more refined version of that grand malady that Othello manifested. And Northrop Frye considers that Leontes is a scaling down of Othello. I beg to differ. Leontes is actually much scarier than Othello, as his madness is self-induced rather than stirred by some Iago. On the contrary, honest Camillo, his courtier, tries to calm him down. Leontes' jealousy may be psychiatrically more refined, but it's also scarier, and it's more complex than Othello's insofar as it is self-fueled. But Leontes is no scaling down of Othello, rather a scaling up, since the mad lion threatens to kill everybody who stands in his way, not just his wife. He orders Camillo to poison Polixenes, threatens to burn Hermione, her newborn daughter, and even their advocate, the courtier Paulina, and eventually makes one victim, his very own son, the boy Mamilius, the innocent sacrificial lamb of the play. If Sicilia ever was an Arcadia of bleating lambs and eternal youth, that's over now. Death has reached its shores, winter rules almighty, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Of course, there are generic differences between tragedy and romance, and these do not allow Leontes to develop into a murderous tragic hero like Othello. Romance does not focus on a single hero like tragedy, but on couples and whole families, and perhaps on action more than character. It wants to elicit wonder, not fear, and thus extreme gestures are frustrated by an active providence, whereas in tragedies the gods are generally absent. Leontes sentences Hermione to death early in the play, and he also has his anagnorisis soon thereafter, whereas Othello needs all 5 acts to grow his rage into murder. Leontes' intended crimes, on the other hand, are as dire as any tyrant's, but providential characters or divine intervention frustrates them. One such providential character, or force of benevolence, to quote Harold Bloom, is Camillo. Instead of poisoning Polixenes, he warns him. Together they flee to Bohemia, leaving poor Hermione behind to face Leontes' rage alone. Polixenes' flight confirms Leontes' suspicions, and the Mad King accuses Hermione of adultery in front of his courtiers. How blessed am I in my just censure, in my true opinion! Alack for lesser knowledge! How accursed in being so blessed! There may be in the cup a spider steeped, and one may drink, depart, and yet partake no venom, for his knowledge is not infected. But if one present the abhorred ingredient to his eye, make known how he has drunk, he cracks his gorge, his sides with violent heft. I have drunk and seen the spider. Camilla was his help in this, his pander. There is a plot against my life, my crown. The lords protest Hermione's innocence, but Leontes insults them and sends his wife to prison. He is persuaded, however, to consult the Delphic oracle about Hermione's guilt. Waiting for the oracle's answer, Leontes loses sleep, innocent sleep, like Macbeth. "Nor night, nor day, no rest," he says. Self-intoxicated like Lear, murderously jealous like Othello, sleepless like Macbeth, Leontes is a genuine tragic hero, whom only the conventions of romance stop short from growing mad like Lear, from killing his wife like Othello, and from terrorizing everybody else like Macbeth. Meanwhile, imprisoned Hermione gives birth to a daughter, but Leontes orders the baby to be burnt alive. Hermione's friend Paulina proves more valiant than any courtier at this point, and in a long verbal duel she accuses the king to be a mad tyrant and rescues the baby on condition that it be exposed. Thus, Paulina asks her husband Antigonus to take the girl to some propitious shore. The ensuing trial supplies further evidence of the king's madness, and nothing against Hermione. On the contrary, it proves her dignity. Thus, in a way, I can say Hermione starts building her monument in this life, as it were. Since Leontes is absolute for death, Hermione is not his, the dignified martyr submits herself to his crazed will. She says, "Sir, you speak a language that I understand not. My life stands in the level of your dreams, which I'll lay down." Luckily, the oracle's answer arrives during the trial and proclaims that Hermione is chaste, Polixenes blameless, Camillo a true subject, Leontes a jealous tyrant, his innocent babe truly begotten, and the king shall live without an heir if that which is lost be not found. Leontes' first reflex is to deny the truth of the oracle, thus adding impiety to jealousy. "The session shall proceed. This is mere falsehood," he proclaims. But the prophecy is fulfilled immediately, and Leontes is informed that his son Mamilius has died of grief. "Apollo's angry, and the heavens themselves do strike at my injustice," Leontes realizes. He has his anagnorisis, as already said, early in the play, and he asks Apollo for pardon, but it's too late. Hermione faints, and Paulina reports her death as well. Leontes has thus destroyed his entire family, Perdita, Hermione, and Mamilius, and has compromised his succession. Let us note at this point that Apollo's oracle is yet another providential agent in the play. All four romances invoke various classical gods. Pericles is dominated by Neptune and Diana, Cymbeline by Jupiter, and Apollo rules in the Winter's Tale. Initially, it is ironical that the god of light and sight, and thus of reason and knowledge, should preside over Leontes' obnubilated jealousy. But the oracle restores the balance in favor of common sense and sanity, and allows a solemn mood to dominate the following parts of the play. Paulina now turns Irene's fury to haunt Leontes, and the king dares not resist this terrible goddess of vengeance. Her curse is indeed terrifying. "But, O thou tyrant, do not repent these things, for they are heavier than all thy woes can stir. Therefore betake thee to nothing but despair. 1,000 knees, 10,000 years together, naked, fasting, upon a barren mountain and still winter in storm perpetual, could not move the gods to look that way thou wert." Leontes accepts to live the rest of his life in rueful solitude. In this he resembles Pericles and Timon of Athens, although unlike them he is less sinned against than sinning. The storm perpetual announced by Paulina unleashes itself immediately. As in King Lear, The Tempest mirrors the turmoil within Leontis's mind. Man and nature are united by one vast, dissonant music. This is not just a storm, but a world dissolving into chaos, as Northrop Frye writes. However, tempests, we know, are also providential forces in Shakespeare's romances. As Pericles was led to Mytilene, Antigonus is transported to the famous coast of Bohemia. Of course, Bohemia has no coast. At sea, Antigonus is visited by the ghost of Hermione, who orders him to call the baby Perdita, the lost one. The ghost is as terrifying as Hamlet's father, or Ariel turned harpy. Thy mother appeared to me last night, for never was dream so like a waking. To me comes a creature, sometimes her head on one side, some another. I never saw a vessel of like sorrow, so filled and so becoming. In pure white robes, like very sanctity, she did approach my cabin where I lay. Thrice before me, and gasping to begin some speech, her eyes became two spouts. When this terrible spirit has melted into air like Ariel, right, Antigonus is certain that Hermione has suffered death. It is important to stress that at this point the audience has all the reasons to share Antigonus's belief that Hermione is actually dead. Antigonus drops the basket containing Perdita, some gold and letters explaining who she was, and exits pursued by a bear. Critics delight in this peculiar stage direction, so please allow me to join the choir. It is, however, less funny to learn that the bear eats much, if not all, of Antigonus. Perdita is then found by an old shepherd, and the deaths of Antigonus on land and of his crew at sea are witnessed by a cloud, the shepherd's son. Thou meetest with things dying, I with things new born, the old shepherd says. This is an important line in this transition scene, which is still dominated by winter and death, but has moved from death-infected Sicilia to benevolent, providential Bohemia. Antigonus and the crew must die, and so must the hateful winter of the Sicilian court, from which they come, which they fled. From now on, nature, including the well-fed bear perhaps, will dominate. We have moved on, or back, to bleating lambs and good-natured shepherds, to spring and music, innocence and love, out of tragedy and into pastoral. Things new born prevail over things dying from now on. Love is stronger than jealousy, spring than winter, baby girls than bearded tyrants, and shepherds than kings. 'Tis a lucky day, boy, and we'll do good deeds on it, the nice old shepherd concludes the scene before a starry night announcing a sunny day can descend upon the subsiding storm, and the curtain can drop on the tragedy of the first three acts. The central part of the play, Act 4, which also represents roughly 1/3 of its length, happens in Bohemia. Time enters the stage as a chorus and informs us that I slide over 16 years and leave the growth untried of that wide gap, since it is in my power to overthrow law and in oneself born hour to plant and overwhelm custom. Your patience this allowing, I turn my glass and give my scene such growing as you had slept between. Leontes, leaving the effects of his fond jealousies so grieving that he shuts up himself, imagine me, gentle spectators, that I now may be in fair Bohemia. And remember well, I mentioned the son of the kings, which Florizel I now name to you. And with speed so pace to speak of Perdita, now grown in grace equal with wandering, what of her ensues I list not prophesy. But let time's news be known when 'tis brought forth. A shepherd's daughter, and what to her adheres, which follows after, is the argument of time. Note that Shakespeare carefully indicates the ages of his nubile heroines in the final plays. Marina redeems corrupt Mitylene and decrepit Pericles 14 years after her birth in a tempest. It takes 15 years and another tempest for Miranda to create a dynastic alliance with Naples, thus allowing her father to get his dukedom back. 16 years after being abandoned on the famous coast of Bohemia, Perdita returns to Sicilia and reconciles the two countries through another dynastic alliance. The next scene opens like a typical comedy, with old Polixenes worried that his son, Prince Florizel, is of late much retired from the court, and may be in love with a low-born girl. Camillo confirms the king's suspicion that Florizel has fallen in love with a shepherd's daughter of a most rare note. William O. Scott is right to note that Polixenes is about to pass as rash and incorrect judgment on a woman as Leontes, for Perdita is as low-born as Hermione was false. In the first act, Leontes embodied the idiotes of the play, the focus of the anti-comic mood, as Northrop Frye notes. 16 years later, it is Polixenes' turn to become the senex iratus, the focus of the comic mood. Disguised behind white beards, Polixenes and Camillo decide to mingle with the cheering crowd of shepherds attending a sheep shearing festival. Summarisicumanin Bohemia turned pastoral, Arcadia. But the white beard and grumpy mood of Polixenes actually spell winter. However, in this pastoral setting, nothing ill can happen. Sad tales are best for winter, merry ones for spring. Leontes was allowed to dominate in gloomy Sicilia, but in sunny Bohemia, Polixenes must give precedence to young Perdita. The mood is that of the wonderful Autolycus, the most amiable of all Shakespearean rogues, as Harold Bloom calls him. The thief Autolycus, a force of benevolence and an instrument of providence, enters the stage, singing, "When daffodils begin to peer with hay the doxy over the dale, why then comes in the sweet of the year, for the red blood reigns in the winter's pale," or something like that. As George Wilson Knight noted, music followed tempests in Shakespeare's romances. Daffodils begin to peer, and red blood reigns in the winter's pale. Flowers and spring have defeated winter. The red blood of love has replaced the black or yellow bile of jealousy. Perdita now enters most goddess-like pranked up, and is greeted by Florizel as Flora peering in April's front. Like Marina, Imogen and Miranda, Perdita is compared to a goddess. She is Flora, a Persephone who does not have to descend into hell. Her floral coronation proclaims life, grace and rejuvenation, as opposed to Ophelia's fantastic garlands of crowflowers, nettles, daisies and long purples, and Lear's crown of rank fumiter and furrow weeds, which announce the tragic hero's death. Nature has been summoned to crown Perdita her goddess, not to claim her back into the embrace of the earth. Florizel and Flora, whose names recall the medieval Floris and Blanchefleur, are Shakespeare's invention. Green's lovers were called Dorastus and Faunia. As Stanley Wells points out, in the sheep-shearing scene, Green's lovers were actually preoccupied by social considerations about rank and marriage, whereas Floriza and Flora's love is cosmic, timeless, mythological. The mythological reading is here not just possible, Shakespeare actually invites it, he even imposes it. If Florizel is merely a comic type, Flora is entirely symbol, as Tilliard suggests. The critic is also right to stress that this scene is the center of the play. The sheep shearing festival is not just a trivial scene featuring vague young women doing eurythmics, but the moment when energy is reversed, to quote Northrop Frye. Winter has lost its grip. Camillo and grumpy Polixenes, who are here to mar Florizel and Flora's love, receive symbolic flowers from Perdita. Reverend sirs, for you there's rosemary and rue. These keep seeming and savour all the winter long. Grace and remembrance be to you both, and welcome to our shearing. Grace and remembrance, or repentance, to last through these men's winter. Polixenes and Camillo have not yet reached their winter, as their fake white beards proclaim. They are still in their autumn, the age of wisdom, according to the calendar of shepherds. The scene moves on gracefully and pleasantly. There is talk about flowers of winter for the old men and flowers of spring for Florizel, and about carnations called nature's bastards. The name prompts Polixenes to explain to Perdita that there are no bastards in nature, and then to digress about nature and art, a frequent Renaissance topic. Carried away by his argument, he forgets his royalty and his opposition to Florizel mésalliance, and explains to Perdita. You see, sweet maid, we marry a gentler scion to the wildest stock, and may conceive a bark of baser kind by bud of nobler race. This is an art which does mend nature. Change it rather, but the art itself is nature. The king later remembers himself, but has to admit that the prettiest low-born lass smacks of something greater than herself, too noble for this place. She dances featly, he tells the old shepherd, Perdita's foster father. So she does anything, the shepherd answers, confirming our impression that Perdita does not merely impersonate, but is an epiphany of the goddess Flora of perfection. The festival continues with the clowns and Autolycus's tomfoolery, which Harold Bloom seems to enjoy, but I shall move swiftly over it in order to reach the conclusion of the episode. In a fit of tyranny symmetrical to Leontes' rage, Polixenes threatens to bar Florizel from succession, to hang the old shepherd, and to have Perdita's beauty scratched with briars. From goddess, Perdita has stooped to fresh piece of excellent witchcraft, from wonder to enchantment, as Polixenes calls her. The young people thus are forced to elope, and Camillo instructs them to sail to Sicilia, where Leontes would welcome his friend's son in order to atone for his past sins. Camillo, however, acts out of self-interest because he wants to spend the end of his life in his home country, and so he also informs Polixenes about his son's flight to Sicilia. The scared shepherds decide to produce Perdita's treasure and letters before the king, in order to show that they are not related to her, and thus to escape hanging. The thief Autolycus, who had been the witness of all these resolutions, leads the shepherds to the king, and thus the act ends with everybody en route to Sicilia. In a novel, this chapter could be called Florizel and Flora. The third part, corresponding to the last act, brings Florizel and Flora, and with them spring, grace, and remembrance, to Sicilia. Leontes, whom we abandoned after his anagnorisis scene, has spent these 16 years in penitence. He skipped harvest, the age of wisdom, and landed directly in a prolonged fourth age of winter and penitence, following Paulina's curse. In Sicilia, as in Narnia, there seems to be ever winter and never Christmas, and thus Leontes' wintry penitence is more curse than atonement. Do as the heavens have done. Forget your evil. With them forgive yourself, a courtier exhorts the king, but Leontes can neither forget Hermione's virtue nor forgive his own crime. The fame of Perdita's beauty precedes her. A servant reports that she is the fairest princess that he had ever beheld, the most peerless piece of earth that ever the sun shone bright on, the rarest of all women. Leontes acknowledges this and compares Perdita to a goddess begetting wonder. Welcome hither as is the spring to the earth, wintry Leontes greets the young couple. Goddesses, spring, wonder, this is the mood of Shakespeare's romances. Leontes recognizes Polixenes' likeness in Florizel, and this is the first step towards rejuvenation and atonement. Were I but 21, your father's image is so hid in you, his very air, that I should call you brother. By welcoming Florizel as a brother, Leontes symbolically reconciles himself to Polixenes. But this is only one half of the atonement process. He still needs to reconcile himself to Perdita, but the girl does not know yet who she is, and Leontes has difficulties recognizing her mother's beauty in her features. In Green's novel, perverted Pandosto fails to recognize Faunia and falls in love with his own daughter. Shakespeare, however, passes very lightly over the menace of incest. Florizel lies that his father would grant precious things as trifles if Leontes would celebrate his marriage to Perdita. The old king does make a pass at Perdita, but Paulina quickly brings him to order. Would he do so, I'd beg your precious mistress, which he counts but a trifle. Sir, my liege, your eye has too much youth in it. Not a month before your queen died, she was more worth such gazes than what you look on now. I thought of her even in these looks I made, he pretends. In Green's novel, Pandosto commits suicide after adding the attempt of incest to murderous jealousy, but Shakespeare does not allow tragedy back into his romance. Polixenes, Camillo, Autolycus, and the shepherds reveal Perdita's identity. The young lovers can now marry, and their old fathers are reconciled. The two kings looked as they had heard of a world ransom or one destroyed. A notable passion of wonder appeared in them, a gentleman reports. This sentence echoes the old shepherd's remark about things dying and things newborn. Winter, jealousy, and tragedy are the things dying, and the world destroyed. That world made two victims, young Mamilius and old Antigonus. It is now the time for things newborn, for Florizel and Flora, for the spring they bring with them, to ransom the frozen world of Sicilia and penitent Leontes. The oracle is fulfilled. The king's daughter is found, the gentleman informs Autolycus in the next scene. The recognition between Leontes and Perdita opens a festival of reconciliation between the two kings, between father and daughter, between father and son, and between kings and shepherds, thus between ages, sexes, and classes. The reconciliation is really universal and includes the royals and the shepherds, not just the two royal families. As the clown reports, the king's son took me by the hand and called me brother, and then the two kings called my father brother, and then the prince my brother and the princess my sister called my father father, and so we wept, and there was the first gentleman-like tears that ever we shed. Of course, these reconciliations and the projected marriage of Florizel and Perdita could be a satisfactory happy ending, but the play has more in store. In Green's Pandosto, the end focuses on the marriage of the young princes, which redeems the world and regenerates society, as in a typical comedy. But this is not a typical pastoral comedy. The pastoral actually ends in Act 4. It is now time for a new type of dramatic and mystical experience, for a new and higher sort of mimesis and of wonder. Every wink of an eye, some new grace will be born, one courtier exclaims. Grace bathes the play as it does all the other romances, and Measure for Measure as well. Paulina now invites the royals to visit the gallery where she is displaying a recently finished statue of Hermione, or so she pretends, made by the famous Roman sculptor Giulio Romano, an artist who would beguile nature of her customer. When all are gathered, Paulina unveils Hermione's statue. As she lived peerless, so her dead likeness, I do well believe, excels whatever yet you looked upon, or hand of man has done. Therefore I keep it lonely, apart. But here it is, prepared to see the life as lively mocked as ever still sleep mocked death. Behold and say 'tis well. And here Paulina draws a curtain and discovers Hermione standing like a statue. Everybody is silent. I like your silence. It the more shows off your wonder, but yet speak, first you, my liege. Comes it not something near? Leontes answers. Her natural posture chide me, dear stone, that I may say indeed thou art Hermione, or rather thou art she in thy not chiding, for she was as tender as infancy and grace. But yet, Paulina, Hermione was not so much wrinkled, nothing so aged as this seems. Silence and wonder and incredulity dominate the scene. Leontes is amazed by the likeness, but also by Hermione's wrinkled appearance. There's magic in thy majesty, Leontes exclaims, and we start to guess that the statue will soon come to life. Is this a magic trick? Is Paulina really the witch Leontes wanted to burn? Is Giulio Romano some Pygmalion, or has Hermione survived hidden in Paulina's house all these years, despite Antigonus's dream of her ghost during a by now long forgotten tempest? Art and nature, reality and illusion are recurrent themes of Shakespeare, as of most Renaissance and Baroque artists. I can recall the riddle offered by the Sphinx guarding the entrance of the Baroque Park of Monsters built by the Orsinis in Bomarzo in Italy. It reads, Tu che entri qua, pon mente parte a parte, dimmi poi se tante meraviglie sien fatte per inganno oppur per arte. Namely, you who enter here, think deeply and tell me if all these wonders are illusions, tricks, or art. The fixture of her eyes has motion in it, as we are mocked with art, Leontes exclaims. I'll draw the curtain. My lord's almost so far transported that he'll think anon it lives, Paulina teases Leontes, in order to heighten the suspense. But then promises the king more amazement. For this, however, it is required you do awake your faith, as she tells the king. The critics who believed this to be Shakespeare's most mystical scene are perhaps right. Proceed. No foot shall stir, Leontes orders. Leontes and the others are stunned and petrified. The statue is in some sense more alive than its beholders, as Charles Frey remarks. Adrien Bonjour is right to stress that we did not know all this time that Hermione was alive, and thus we participate in a veritable miracle. Music interrupts the beholder's religious silence, and we remember that music and grace are interwoven in the other romances as well. As Northrop Frye notices, all arts are involved in this final recognition scene. Giulio Romano's sculpture, which is also painted, so sculpture and painting as well, poetry and music concur to generate wonder and delight. Paulina now commands, music, Awake her, strike, and then music is heard. 'Tis time, descend, bestow no more, approach, strike all that look upon with marvel. Come, I'll fill your grave up, stir, nay, come away, bequeath to death your numbness, for from him dear life redeems you. You perceive she stirs, and now Hermione actually comes down. What follows requires a good director and calls for a small digression on my part. Before writing this chapter, I watched a rather mediocre, I should say, BBC staging of The Winter's Tale. Hermione's resurrection, which is obviously the mystical apex of the play, was almost anticlimactic in its dullness. On the other hand, I can recall the almost mystical experience I had, I think back in 2007, attending a representation of Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, directed by Marianne Elliott at the National Theatre in London. At the end of the play, as Joan is burnt at the stake, incense, the smell of incense, fills the Olivia Theatre, and thus suggesting the sanctification of the Virgin from Orleans. As she is burned, incense is burned, so Joan is born in the skies as she dies on earth. If I were to direct The Winter's Tale, which of course will never happen, I would have incense burned when Hermione descends from the pedestal, so that all the spectators' senses be involved in this mystical experience: music, incense, poetry, images. Tilliard considers the continued existence of Leontes and Hermione a matter of subordinate expedience, and gives precedence to Florizel and Perdita's marriage. However, I don't agree. The reconciliation between Leontes and Perdita, as you know, is not shown on the stage, and Florizel and Perdita's marriage is only announced. One recognition scene is enough, Harold Bloom writes. Moreover, in this act, Perdita, who dominated Act 4, hardly ever speaks. I counted 3 interventions, actually, and none after Hermione's rebirth. The focus is now entirely on the older generation. The scene presents the reconciliation of Leontes and Hermione and announces the marriage of Paulina and Camillo as well, another Shakespearean innovation. And thus the two forces of the play, also belonging to the older generations, who have helped preserve the lives of Hermione, Perdita, and Polixenes, also take part in this final festival of marriages and reconciliation. The play begins and ends with Leontes' imagination. His jealous fancy and this mystical rapture transform reality, and Hermione on both occasions seems what she is not. First an adulteress, now a goddess, a resurrected goddess. The action thus moves from appearance to reality, from mirage to substance, as Northrop Frye notes. In her only address in this scene, Hermione tells Perdita that she has preserved herself because the oracle gave her hope to see her daughter again. She asks to hear Perdita's story, but we already know it, so that Paulina, the actual stage manager or director of this act, intervenes. There's time enough for that, she says. The play ends with Leontes announcing that everybody will demand and answer to his part, performed in this wide gap of time since first we were dissevered. Time triumphs over itself in its eternal return. Spring follows winter, life defeats death, mercy, grace, and love conquer hatred and jealousy. The 16 years in which Leontes mourned and Hermione lay hidden by Paulina are time lost, but what follows can be called time regained, to use Northrop Frye's Proustian analogy. On a less optimistic note, however, new life may lie on the other side of years lost to tyranny, but this life will not be the same as it once was, as Stephen Greenblatt points out. Hermione is wrinkled, as you saw. The young Prince Mamilius remains dead, he is not resurrected, and Antigonus cannot be resurrected once the famous bear from the Bohemian coast has digested most of him at least. There is a hint of melancholy in this otherwise apotheotic ending. We can already hear Prospero, who knows that once all the necessary marriages have been celebrated, every third thought shall be his grave.